Hi there, I'm Dean Heskin, President and CEO of Swiss American Trading Corporation. You are tuned into our podcast entitled The Secret War on Cash, where we take a hard look at some of the hard issues of today's financial markets, today's economy. I have with me my co-host, Chris Agelastos. Chris, good morning. How are you this morning?
I'm doing horrible.
Doing horrible. Well, that's not good.
I just always say I'm doing well, so I figured, I got to change it up or something.
Well, I don't know if we mentioned this our last podcast, but Chris is getting over COVID, and I think that's you're out of the woods as far as being contagious and whatnot.
That was horrible, but only for a few days, thankfully. It was much shorter than the initial round I went through in 2020.
Well, your body's used to it now, so you're COVID strong, we'll call it.
There we go.
Well, I think I don't mean to belittle or make light of COVID, but I think there are certain parts of our economy that's got a little case of the COVID or something like that.
For sure.
Getting right into our podcast for today, this is a topic that, in the 32 years I've been in this business, it's always been here and it's always been discussed, but I will say it's been a very mild concern to the average American consumer or what have you. And that is the federal fiscal burden is what they're calling it here, or our debt burden in this country, specifically as it pertains to the government. And I will say, however, that just in the last few months in particular, I mean, this is a problem. It's been a runaway train forever. Our debt has, but as we've discussed in our previous podcasts, it's that, as you put it, I think, Chris, that can that keeps getting kicked down the road.
Yeah.
It looks like, though, we could be running out of road to be kicking that can down at this point. And as you look at this first article, how the federal fiscal burden consumes 93% of America's wealth.
Yeah.
And when I first saw that headline, I was intrigued by it. I'm like, okay, because we've heard. I don't want to put words into anyone's ears or mouth, yourself included. However, I can say that I have heard many different comparisons that have been used as to kind of put some kind of perspective as to what our fiscal problem or deficit problems are in this country, as it relates to the amount of taxable dollars it consumes, things of this nature. So when I saw this, how it consumes 93% of America's wealth, I was intrigued, and I was like, well, what are they talking about exactly when they say it consumes 93% of America's wealth? And what I found fascinating is that and I'm going to let you kind of explain this further, but as I even just start reading the article, that you'll see, if you're tuning in, the description of this podcast, you'll have a link for it. Or if you're watching this, you'll see a link there that you can click on as well. That's 93% of the wealth Americans have accumulated since our nation was founded.
Yeah. It's pretty crazy.
That was quite a few years ago.
Yeah.
And they estimate that number to be $152 trillion. So when you're talking about the fact that we have a federal fiscal burden that has consumed 93%, not of current America's wealth, but lifetime America's wealth, that's a problem.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to say, so that's what's cool about this article is they're really trying to kind of give you some perspective, because I know a lot of times when we talk about these, huge numbers, I mean, trillions, right? I mean, we're used to talking about a handful of billionaires in the world, but when you get into trillions, these numbers, it's just mind-boggling, and it's hard to really, wrap your brain around it. But when you consider that only $152 trillion of wealth has been created in the United States since 1776. And the U.S. government is currently on the hook for $142 trillion in burdens. It really shows you that basically we've spent all the money and the wealth creation that we've made in this country, over 90%. And they point out in here how the media doesn't really talk about it. They ignore it a lot, as do the politicians, because they really don't have any good solutions for it. You hear them talk about the debt, right? Our annual debt, but they never really go into the whole big picture. The debt is 26 trillion. I almost said only, but that's a huge number. But when you consider, our total liabilities of 142 trillion, 26 trillion sounds small. And they point out in here they would need over $1 million in cash from every household in the United States to come up with that $142 trillion. So I don't know about you, but I don't know many households that are even have the $1 million sitting there to give up, but certainly would want to give it up. So, this is going to come from future generations. They're going to have to either increase the retirement age, reduce Social Security benefits, because that's a big part of it. They're going to have to find ways to create this money, because it just doesn't exist in these numbers. It's quite staggering.
Yeah, and those numbers there, that statistic you cited in the article there, that 142 trillion, and as they say, and I'll just touch on it briefly, it amounts to $430,000 for every person living in the United States. Now, a lot of the times over the years when you heard, how much per person, in fact, I believe way back when it was like per working person. How many people had jobs? In other words, this is how many people. Right. You'd hear a number associated with that. This is the same for every person, and I've seen in reading this article. There's no caveat there. Every person would include, I believe, a person like literally a newborn that was just born. I mean, it's looking at how many people are living in the United States, and then they boil that down to, $1 million, as you mentioned, per household, which is 2 times the annual U.S. economic output, or our GDP, and then 30 times our annual federal revenues. So we want to talk about like a mountain that you can't even climb. I mean, and this doesn't, all of us, like you and me doing this podcast and those tuning in, we all have our own responsibilities financially, et cetera. And these numbers, this would be if everything was frozen right now and we just started working on paying it back. But things aren't frozen. These numbers continue to grow because the obligations and the money that our government is spending just continues to climb. And these numbers that we just mentioned here a second ago, they only are going to compound even more so as this continues to occur. Yeah. And so it's a problem. And adding to that, or to kind of go with this first article, the second one here, the United States records its second biggest July deficit in history, as 25% of tax revenue goes to pay interest. Yeah. So now, your revenue source, the majority of it is going to just paying interest on debt. And that kind of speaks to what we were talking about before. If we kind of break this down to like just what a normal household has to deal with, when you have 25% of what you're taking in is going towards just interest, and we're living in an economy, let's not forget, where things are not getting less expensive out there. By and large, things are getting more expensive. The abilities a family has to kind of take care of their putting food on the table, putting a roof over their head, all the different things associated with just everyday life and living, that is becoming more expensive as well. So look, tell us more like about 25% of the tax revenue. Where do we go from here?
Right. Well, it's even more so because I like, trying to put this into, something you can really kind of bite off and again, try to wrap your head around. So the government in July took in $330 billion in income, and they spent $573 billion. So again, big numbers, hard to relate to. But if you break it down to, a household, right, an average household, that would be like somebody earning about $10,000 in a month, earning $6,500 a month and spending $10,000. So significantly more than you're bringing in. Well, if you did that, then
I know people like that, Chris, actually.
Yeah, that sounds much more common. And those people aren't going to last very long, right? Going at that rate. And 25% of that 10,000 spent would be about 2,500 just in interest on debt. So, and I know we've heard this example before. If I ran my household like the government likes to run our economy, I'd be bankrupt. And it's true. And really, what they talk about a bit in here as well is that our politicians are really buying votes. We hear about these numbers and spending, and oftentimes it's very political, and you have the left saying that it's military spending. The warmongers on the right are spending so much on military, when in fact, from 1960 to today, military spending has gone from 53% of our budget down to only 17. So it's been greatly reduced over the years. You hear, the left talk about the right, always wanting to give tax cuts to their rich friends, right? Well, tax revenue over the last 80 years has stayed about the same, regardless of years where there were some cuts in one area, but maybe it grew in another. And so where all of this money really goes is social programs, which, again, comparing it to the 1960s, it was about 21% of our spending. Now it's 64%. So it's gone up by about threefold. And that's really what it is. It's politicians giving more money through different programs to try and attract voters to their party. And all this is going to do is going to continue to contribute to rapid inflation, lower wages, and potentially higher taxes if they ever really want to get this under control. That money's going to have to come from somewhere. So it's, both of these articles today just really point out what a horrible financial situation we are in. And like you said, how much longer can we really kick the can down the road before, all of us as citizens are going to have to pay for this in some way, whether it's just reduced standard of living, which I'm sure nobody wants to go down that path, or just giving up future entitlements and benefits. Maybe even though I've been paying into Social Security all my life, maybe I'll never be able to draw on it. Those are the types of decisions that we are going to have to make soon enough, and that's going to be painful for a lot of people.
Right. Well, you mentioned too, we're going into this political season, and for our entire life, I mean, even prior to our life, you've got, by and large, you've got the Democrats, suggesting that the Republicans are bad, and the Republicans suggesting the Democrats are bad. I'm not here to say which is which, albeit I have my own perspective on that, which tend to lean more towards things that would be financially for capitalism, improvement, and so forth. But that aside, as we go through this season, what we've heard our entire life is how, this whole tax discussion, tax the rich more, tax breaks for the middle class, and it goes back and forth. And depending on, what time of day it is and what time of year, you are going to hear much the same kind of back and forth. Nothing really has changed much given the statistics that you've mentioned. And you've got all these elected officials, these politicians who are the ones who are going back and forth on this. And the only thing that's happened is they continue to spend money at a rate that is beyond even belief. It's so much.
Right.
So that they can't, there's really been nothing that's changed much with the tax situation. And it's kind of almost like they keep us distracted with look over here. And all the while, and we know this is happening, they're spending more money and more money and more money, and it just continues to go out of control. And the reason as I saw this, and, talking about debt is always, the government debt in particular, always kind of just seems like the road to nowhere. But it's getting to a point now where it's getting to where I don't think it's just something that they can continue to neglect or continue to kind of push that, again, kick that can down the road, because now you do have these numbers growing so exponentially fast, number one. And number two, you've got the alliance of BRICS out there that is threatening the dollar in and of itself. You have central banks who have been taking major positions in gold, which is to say as well, they're kind of getting a little bit of an arm's length from the dollar as well. Right. So the vulnerabilities are there. And then you couple that with, what's happening with our debts, our deficits, et cetera. It's a recipe for disaster. So if you want to find out more about this recipe for disaster, for those of you tuning in, Say it every time. I'll say it again. Well, not every time, but almost every time. Get our report entitled The Secret War on Cash. Just a great starting point to give you a really good overview of what's happening in our financial markets and our economy. Totally free to you. Just contact us at 1-800-289-2646, or feel free to visit us online at swissamerica.com. We hope you're subscribed to this podcast, and if you're not, please do so, as we'd love to keep you informed and bring you some more very valuable information as we have today. Chris, thank you so much for being here, as always, and look forward to having you again real soon.
Thanks. Take care.